In this video, I want to use a couple different methods to take the derivative of the square root of x. We've seen one version of this in a previous video, but I wanted to just kind of pull it out into its own video, and then I wanted to double check that using the inverse derivative rule that we just derived. All right, so here's one way of thinking about it, that we're just using a bunch of exponent powers. That when we've got g of x is equal to the square root of x, that's just the same thing using our exponent rules as saying that it's equal to x to the 1/2 power. And because it's in this form, we can use the power rule. And the power rule says that to find the derivative of g of x, we're going to take the exponent, we're going to move it down to the coefficient. There's nothing to multiply here, so it's just 1/2. And then we take x and then we subtract 1 from the exponent. So 1/2 times x to the 1/2 minus 1. Well, 1/2 minus 1 is negative 1/2. So we've got 1/2 times x to the negative 1/2 power. And then once again, we can use an exponent rule to say that since this is a negative exponent, I can make it positive if I move it into the denominator. So another way of writing this, the derivative of g is 1 over 2 times x to the positive 1/2 power. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this exponent rule one last time to say that x to the 1/2 power, I could just write that as the square root of x. So this is what we can think of as g prime is equal to 1 over 2 times the square root of x to find the square root, the derivative of the square root function. And that's cool. Let's also see if we get the same answer if we use the inverse derivative rule, because we know that if f of x is equal to x squared, we know the derivative of that function, then we can find the derivative of the inverse function. And the inverse of the squaring function is the square root function. So let's see what the inverse derivative rule says. It says we need to know the derivative of f. So the derivative of x squared is just 2x. And so the inverse derivative rule says that g prime of x is equal to 1 over f prime of g of x. And let's just take this step by step. F prime g of x is the square root of x. And what's the rule for f prime? F prime says you just double the input. So if our input is the square root of x, then doubling that gives us 2 times the square root of x. And so we can see that we got the same answer using both the power rule over here and our exponent rules, and using the inverse derivative rule and our knowledge that x squared is the inverse and that we knew the derivative of x squared. So that's another handy explanation of how you can use the inverse derivative rule to, to learn about some new things about functions or verify some old things that we already knew.